Quantum leaders, the arbitrator, applying the principle of quantum consciousness, oscillation between strong and weak forces. The arbitrator's natural style, analytical, balanced, and rule-bound, is rooted in the pursuit of fairness and logic. They act as the system's truth filter, examining what holds up under scrutiny and what does not. Yet through the quantum principle of oscillation between strong and weak forces, the arbitrator evolves beyond static judgment into dynamic discernment. Their power is not only in their logic, but in their capacity to move between firm decisions and open listening, between objective truth and contextual wisdom. True quantum arbitration requires a rhythm, not rigidity. With a motivation direction of away from, the arbitrator is highly attuned to error, injustice, or bias. The strong force here shows up as their impulse to correct, to clarify, and to protect the system from distortion. But if they lean too heavily into correction, they may create cold distance or over-control. The weak force invites pause, receptivity, and compassion. When they learn to wait and feel before rendering judgment, their clarity becomes informed by humanity, not divorced from it. Their attention focus on self makes them consistent and self-reliant in their reasoning. The strong force expresses through autonomous decision-making and personal integrity. But when over-applied, it can result in isolation or a belief that only their view is objective. The weak force is interpersonal attunement, considering how their logic lands, how others perceive fairness, and what emotional context surrounds the facts. This oscillation between internal certainty and external reflection makes their conclusions not only accurate, but resonant. With an internal frame of reference, they trust their judgment deeply. The strong force supports structured thinking and high standards. But when this calcifies into dogma, their discernment becomes brittle. The weak force invites humility, a willingness to revisit, revise, or even reverse a judgment when new insight arrives. Oscillation between principled clarity and adaptive openness upgrades their leadership into evolving truth management. Their procedural operational style reinforces system integrity. The strong force shows up in rule enforcement and consistency of execution. But when systems shift, rules require interpretation. The weak force is contextual sensing, the ability to perceive when a guideline must flex to honor a deeper justice. When they toggle between strict rule logic and situational discernment, the arbitrator becomes not a rule enforcer, but a guardian of ethical flow. Their specific viewpoint gives them a gift for detail. The strong force is precision in language, data, and cause-effect tracking. But too much focus on individual facts can obscure underlying themes. The weak force invites them to zoom out, to trace how the parts relate to the whole. When they oscillate between analytical sharpness and pattern sensitivity, they develop rulings and strategies that are both technically sound and systemically wise. With a solo work preference, they process deeply on their own. The strong force is clarity unclouded by noise, but over time, this can disconnect them from human feedback. The weak force is dialogic openness, selectively engaging with others to test assumptions, hear alternate views, and build more socially intelligent judgments. When they toggle between solitude and consultation, they hold authority that's not only exact, but trusted. Their emotional engagement is dissociated, helping them stay calm under pressure. The strong force is objectivity, especially in crisis. But complete detachment can result in coldness or a sense of injustice, even when they're right. The weak force is emotional presence, feeling just enough to weigh the human cost of the decision. This doesn't mean being swayed by emotion, but accounting for its impact. Their oscillation here makes their logic not just clean, but conscious. As matchers, they adhere to precedent and tradition. The strong force is historical consistency. But systems evolve, and what worked before may not apply now. The weak force is innovation, recognizing when a precedent no longer reflects current values. The arbitrator becomes visionary when they toggle between what has always been fair and what fairness needs to become. Their through-time orientation supports long-range fairness and sequencing. The strong force builds legacy structures, but justice delayed is justice denied. The weak force is timeliness, knowing when swift action is the greater virtue. When they move between deliberate cadence and decisive timing, their leadership creates lasting systems that respond in real time. And with a primary drive of things, they bring decisions into material form. Clear policies, guidelines, rulings. The strong force is the deliverable itself, but the weak force is the quality of presence behind it. The tone of the email, the timing of the announcement, the willingness to sit with ambiguity before defining truth. When they oscillate between output and informed restraint, their outcomes don't just resolve, they elevate. In this oscillatory model, the arbitrator steps beyond judgment as finality and into judgment as living stewardship. They no longer see truth as fixed, but as something to be upheld and evolved in rhythm with the field. Their leadership moves from black and white reasoning to adaptive discernment, and in that space, they no longer enforce order. They refine justice itself. Quantum leaders, the arbitrator. Dynamic equilibrium as nature's core design. The arbitrator's natural style, clear thinking, fairness-oriented, and principle-driven, tends to seek consistency, logic, and coherence in all things. They are often the ones holding the boundary, anchoring accountability, or protecting standards. But in a quantum view of dynamic equilibrium, they are asked to go deeper, to become not just enforcers of truth, but balancers of complexity. Real justice is not static, it is responsive. The arbitrator reaches leadership mastery not by locking systems down, but by learning how to stabilize while still flexing. Their decisions become less about rigid fairness and more about living relational balance. With a motivation direction of away from, the arbitrator is instinctively wired to prevent error and injustice. The strong force appears as judgment, correction, and formalization. But in dynamic systems, what's wrong may be part of a necessary evolution. The weak force is patience, watching a situation unfold before labeling it a problem. When the arbitrator allows space for the system to self-correct before intervening, their judgments carry timeless wisdom rather than urgency. Their attention focus on self gives them internal consistency and trust in their standards. The strong force is self-reliance in decision-making, but dynamic equilibrium invites interpersonal coherence. Are others aligning too? Is my clarity isolating or integrating? The arbitrator balances their solo truth tracking with occasional relational tuning, not to outsource their clarity, but to calibrate its effect. With an internal frame of reference, they lean on logic and principle. The strong force is timeless standards, but the weak force introduces timing and context. A judgment that is technically correct, but emotionally mistimed, can destabilize more than it resolves. When the arbitrator listens not just to what's true, but to when the system is ready for it, their decisions support longer-range balance. Their procedural operational style makes them natural system regulators. The strong force shows up in codified rules and clear structures, but the weak force asks, does the rule fit the current moment? Does it help, or has it become a constraint? Equilibrium for the arbitrator means honoring the structure without being ruled by it. They become fair, but not mechanical. Their specific viewpoint tracks fine distinctions with skill. The strong force is exactness, but the weak force invites general patterns. What's emerging across the data, the dialogue, the resistance? When the arbitrator balances fine observation with big picture sensing, they move from courtroom logic to whole system design. With a solo work preference, they often process in privacy. The strong force is clarity found in distance, but equilibrium is relational. Justice requires contact. When they move into brief, intentional exchange, they gain real-time feedback that keeps their logic from becoming disconnected abstraction. Their fairness becomes felt, not just defined. Their emotional engagement is dissociated. They guard objectivity. The strong force is clean judgment, but the weak force is warmth. People need to feel not only that the answer is right, but that it comes from care. When the arbitrator offers tone, timing, and presence, not emotion but attunement, their judgments don't just land, they restore relational coherence. As matchers, they trust what has worked before. The strong force is precedence, but equilibrium evolves. When they sense that precedent now limits nuance, they shift from replication to adaptation, rebalancing fairness without betraying the core principle. Their judgments become instruments of growth, not enforcement of history. Their through-time orientation gives them sequencing strength. The strong force creates clear timelines for action, escalation, or change, but too much linearity ignores emergent readiness. The weak force is pacing with the field. What needs to move faster? What needs to slow down? When they build timelines with sensitivity, not just structure, they create motion that feels natural, not imposed. And with a primary drive of things, they like to land clarity in form, rulings, documents, decisions. But the weak force asks, what's the tone behind the form? How does this decision affect flow? They balance finality with follow-up, precision with permission. Their work stops being a verdict and becomes an inflection point for new coherence. In this lens, the arbitrator becomes more than a judge. They become a regulator of energetic fairness across time and space. Their justice doesn't just protect, it evolves the system toward more intelligent balance. They no longer settle debates. They design fields of functional harmony. Through dynamic equilibrium, they stop chasing the perfect answer and start embodying right timing, right truth, right presence. That's when they no longer defend order. They generate it. Quantum leaders, the arbitrator, observer effect, and the collapse of possibility. The arbitrator's natural style, logical, impartial, and oriented toward factual clarity, makes them appear like a neutral evaluator in systems of complexity. But under the quantum principle of the observer effect, neutrality is revealed as an illusion. The arbitrator's perceptions, conclusions, and even silent assumptions don't just analyze reality, they shape it. What they look for, they reinforce. What they expect, they subtly construct. Their presence isn't passive, it collapses potential into precedent. True leadership emerges when the arbitrator becomes conscious of the power of their gaze. With a motivation direction of away from, the arbitrator habitually looks for bias, inaccuracy, or unfair advantage. The strong force here is discernment. But if they continually observe for misalignment, they begin to anchor the system in defensiveness or overcorrection. The observer effect challenges them to also scan for integrity, coherence, and sincere effort. When they hold a lens of possibility as well as protection, their systems begin to move toward regenerative fairness, not just the avoidance of harm. Their attention focus on self supports internal consistency. The strong force is independence of judgment. But what they assume silently about themselves, I must always be impartial, I must not be swayed, I must be the final word, becomes instruction for how others treat them and the system. If they observe themselves as the sole rational mind in the room, the system contracts. But if they begin to see themselves as a guide within a shared intelligence, their neutrality becomes coherence, not control. With an internal frame of reference, they rely on their internal calibration of what is fair. But the observer effect reveals, even internal conclusions send signals. If they hold the belief that this team won't follow through, or this process always breaks, those assumptions begin to collapse future potential. The arbitrator evolves when they learn to audit their inner narratives, not just for accuracy, but for effect. Their inner conclusions shape the architecture of the group's trajectory. Their procedural operational style gives them comfort in rules, steps, and fairness logic. But how they view a procedure, as liberating or limiting, ethical or bureaucratic, becomes the felt experience of those who engage it. When the arbitrator observes systems with curiosity and generosity, not just correctness, they open pathways instead of closing them. The attitude behind the rule becomes more influential than the rule itself. Their specific viewpoint allows them to spot flaws others miss. The strong force is accountability through precision. But too much observation for what's wrong collapses space for what could be right. The arbitrator matures when they balance their flaw detection with pattern recognition. Where is the system already self-correcting? Where is trust already growing? These subtle reorientations expand what becomes visible and what becomes possible. With a solo work preference, they reflect deeply in private. The strong force here is clarity, untainted by groupthink. But their solitude doesn't neutralize their influence. The energy they carry when they return, a quiet judgment, a subtle disapproval, an unspoken conviction, alters the room. When they realize that presence transmits, even without words, they begin refining their internal environment as part of their leadership hygiene. Their emotional engagement is dissociated. They don't project emotion into their decisions. But unacknowledged feeling still enters the field. Frustration leaks through tone. Cynicism radiates through posture. The observer effect reframes emotional neutrality as emotional authorship. When the arbitrator chooses to name what is present without indulging it, they become energetically trustworthy. Their emotional regulation stops being suppression and becomes a conscious frequency-setting act. As matchers, they rely on precedent and structure. The strong force is replicating fairness models that have worked. But what they observe in the past also limits what they allow in the future. If they continually look for how a situation resembles a past failure, they recreate the failure. When they observe with the question, what wants to emerge now that hasn't existed yet? They open the system to new legalities of fairness, not just inherited forms. Their through-time orientation helps them track timing and sequence, but observing the timeline too narrowly, it should be done by now, or this will never scale, can suppress emergence. The arbitrator upgrades their leadership when they begin to treat time as responsive. What wants to happen now? Is the system showing new readiness? Their timing moves from expectation to synchronization. And with a primary drive of things, they seek tangible outcomes. Decisions, policies, rulings, closures. But these things don't just land into the field, they transmit worldview. Every decision contains an invisible message. This is what we value. This is what we allow. This is what we protect. When the arbitrator becomes intentional about what they're reinforcing with each judgment, their outputs become blueprints for possibility, not just endpoints of logic. In this light, the arbitrator is revealed not just as an evaluator, but as a powerful architect of probability. They don't merely determine what is fair, they shape what becomes possible to believe in, trust, and enact within the system. Their consciousness doesn't sit behind the verdict, it writes the next chapter. When they choose their lens with care, they don't just defend fairness, they construct futures of integrity.